On today's Locked On Jayhawks, we do a deep dive on Nicolas Timberlake and why he would be a big get for KU headed into 2023-24.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can hear me as well, Monday through Friday. Rock Chalk Sports Talk from 3 to 6 p.m. on KLWN in Lawrence. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get any of your podcasts. And you can also find us on YouTube and subscribe to the show there. On today's edition of Locked On Jayhawks, we're going to be doing a deep dive on Nicolas Timberlake. I want to do these with some of the players that have visited or will visit KU. We don't need to do this with every, transfer person who KU reaches out to, but at least the players who go on visits, which Nicolas Timberlake did. I think it's worthwhile and worth the time. And Timberlake represents the first visit, I believe, of the transfer portal class. I mean, obviously, KU had like an in-home visit with like Jamil Reynolds. They've had Zoom meetings with different players, but the first visit to KU was Nicolas Timberlake. So let's get into the deep dive. We'll get to his strengths and weaknesses. We'll get to how he would fit in Kansas, what it would mean for the roster and everything. And then, we'll get to maybe next week some other deep dives, and also we will get to some more top 10 rankings of different positions later next week as the transfer portal continues to churn and be a never-ending cycle that comes through for us. So first things first, before we get into the strengths and weaknesses, kind of the scouting report, where are things at right now with KU and Nicolas Timberlake? Well, first of all, he had his visit. His visit was last weekend. He came out on Friday. I believe he left on Easter Sunday. He came out for the spring showcase Friday night. I'm sure he did all sorts of great things on Saturday and shown around places. And I don't know which players were the ones that were kind of showing him around, and sure let him have a good time and everything. Now, a lot of times, as far as the transfer portal game goes, it's very dependent. Like, you almost have to get the kid to commit to the school at the end of the visit or on the visit. That didn't happen with Nicolas Timberlake, but this seems to very much be a kid who is definitely very cerebral with this decision, which, more power to you that you're going to take everything into account. He went on a North Carolina visit, and they tried to maybe get him to commit and, wasn't successful. He ended up leaving, coming to KU, doesn't end up committing. Now he's going to Connecticut this weekend to have a visit with the reigning national champions. I would imagine he's not going to commit on sight and scene there either, because again, I think what he's going to do is probably, after he has all these visits, take everything into account, sit down, have some conversations with, the close people to him that matter about it, and figure out everything that is the plus and minus for every school and make a calculated decision that way. Never blame a kid for doing something like that. So I don't necessarily view this as one of those, like, a lot of times if you do have a kid who visits and they don't commit and then they go visit somewhere else, that can be kind of a bad sign that, like, oh, he's not going to come here. I think in the case of Nicolas Timberlake, that's just who he is. He's just someone who wants to make a measured decision as a veteran player, a sixth-year player in college basketball, an experienced player that is just more mature into making a type of decision that way. That is probably the smarter way to do things. So, still absolutely a viable option for KU. Seems like KU would love to have him, and it makes a lot of sense when you look at the things that he does well, and when you look at some of the deficiencies that next year's Kansas team could have on the roster that we look at and say, well, you don't have this, you don't have that, you need more shooting, you need more scoring, and you always want experienced players out of the transfer portal. He fits a lot of that bill, and there's a reason they set up a visit on him. I think they're still, in on him and trying to keep pressure applied to make sure that they're in it to the very last part of this and can possibly try to get a commitment out of it. He's, I don't think probably like, I think priority number one for Kansas is Hunter Dickinson. And, I don't know where he would rank in terms of, for Timberlake, the priority list goes here, but we did yesterday, the top 10 list of combo guards that maybe could fit in for KU. And he was tier 2. We only had 2 players in tier 1, Max Asmus and Tyler Perry. Hasn't really heard much in terms of KU's interest in either of those guys, or if there's reciprocated interest, or where those relationships might be going. In theory, Timberlake right now is the number one like combo guard that KU has prioritized on their list. Keep that in mind as we head into things here. All right, let's get into the strengths and weaknesses side of things for his game and what he could bring to KU in just a second. But first, this episode of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by Built Bar. If you're like me and you want to make healthier snack choices, but you don't want to compromise on taste, I've got just the thing for you: Built Bars and Built Puffs. Built Bars are healthy, they taste amazing, and you're not going to think they're good for you because of how amazing they taste, but they are. Covered in 100% real dark chocolate, and they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, cookies, and cream. I don't know how they do it, but they taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. Only 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, and a whopping 17 grams of protein. That's going to get you through the day, right? You don't want a snack that not only is unhealthy for you, but then all this you eat it and an hour later you're hungry again. Built Bar, going to fill you up, going to be good for you, and it tastes good. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. You can still order them at Built.com, and you can still get all your specialty flavors at Built.com. But you can go into your nearest Walmart or Sam's Club today and get some of the different flavors that they have. You can go to Walmart, head to the pharmacy section, get yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate bar, or coconut puffs. Head to Sam's Club, get a 13-bar box with hit flavors like brownie batter puff. Say that 5 times fast. Puffs. You can thank me later with Built Bar. Strengths and weaknesses to the game of one Nicolas Timberlake. Let's start with the strengths. The shooting, obviously. Need, in my opinion, right now is shooting and guys who can score the ball. Last season, KU was about an average three-point shooting team to begin with, and that ended up being a flaw that hurt them. And if you took Grady Dick off, then the rest of the team was, below average at three-point shooting at best, collectively. So that automatically was something they're looking to improve from last year. But then you lose Grady Dick, who was your best three-point shooter. You lose Jalen Wilson, who was your highest volume three-point shooter and, was about average in terms of his percentage. And now it's like, well, how do we even just get back to where we were last year and then try to improve on it because it wasn't good enough? And then beyond that, another thing is, do they have enough guys who can create shots for themselves and hit shots for you in tough situations? Last year was Jalen Wilson. Grady was more of someone who, was created for him, created off the ball, working off a screen, or somebody driving into the paint and him getting a spot up opportunity in the corner, or him cutting off the ball. We saw Kevin McCullough create a little bit toward the end of the season. He had that nice spin move into the lane and some nice drives really over the last 3 or 4 weeks of the season. But for the most part, KU didn't have enough creation. It was every so often KJ would, drive in on a center. Every so often DeJuan would have sweeping right-handed hook, but it wasn't consistent all the way through the roster. You need more of those things: shot creation and shooting the basketball. And when you look at the roster KU has for next year, it's obviously very incomplete, but this should be a team that has pretty good amount of athleticism. Obviously, they're looking to add more on the wing, but KJ is a good athlete. Ernest and Zuby, those are pretty good athletes for you. They can throw down a lot of lobs and get up there and, catch rebounds high and get blocks and stuff at the center position. So you got pretty good athletes there. The freshmen you bring in, like Marcus Adams, good athlete. Chris Johnson, good athlete. Jamari McDowell, good athlete. Elmarco Jackson, great athlete. So you should have a decent amount of good athletes throughout the team. And then you have defensive pillars. Like DeJuan Harris was the Big 12 Defensive Player of the Year. Ernest Udeh and Zuby Ejiofor in year 2 should be even better defensively and at rim protection and rebounding. KJ can be a good defender for you. You have a good base to the defense. And if you have some of those athletic freshmen, you would think they have at least potential to be good defenders. But what you're missing is that shooting, and that is what Nicolas Timberlake brings to the table. So in his 4th year of school, he was a 5th-year player last year. He'll be a 6th-year player this next year. In his 4th year of school, Timberlake shot 40.6% from 3 on 5.6 attempts per game. So good volume there, very good percentage. Last season, his 5th year of school, he shot 41.6% from 3 on 6.7 attempts per game. Again, very high volume, very good efficiency. He's also shot over 80% at the foul line the last 3 seasons to show you more about his shooting ability. And one of the more impressive things, he shot well against better opponents. You obviously have the question, how is he going to jump up in competition from the Colonial and where Towson plays to the Big 12? Versus KenPom top 100 teams, 29 of 63 on 3-point shots last season. That is 46%. Versus KenPom top 50 teams, limited sample, just 8 of 18, but that's still 44%. And for what it's worth, he has 2 career games against Virginia, who we always think of as this like defensive juggernaut in a Power 5 level. He went 5 of 9 from 3 in the 2 career games he played against Virginia. But if you total it all up over the last 3 seasons for some more sample size, versus KenPom top 100 competition, you get 17 games over 3 seasons where he went 50 of 113. That is 44% on 113 three-point tries. A little better sample size. That's a great percentage to have. Now, you're going to be playing top 100 every night in the Big 12, but at least he showed that he did it, even in the limited sample size, better than the alternative, right? His shooting level or his level of shooting, I think, comes in a myriad of different forms too, which is really important and really nice. So with like Grady Dick, he was an unbelievable three-point shooter, but because he was a freshman, he was still learning how to move without the ball. He was still learning how to operate off of screens. He was still learning some of the intricacies of the game that, like, for instance, if you compare to Ochai Agbaji the season before, Ochai was like the best in the country at doing those things, moving without the ball. But Ochai was a senior. Ochai was an older player. It takes time to learn that stuff. Grady Dick did about as good as you could ask for a young freshman, but he was a younger player. Nicolas Timberlake is an older player. He'll be in year 6. He knows how to move without the ball. He knows some of the intricacies. Last season, he was 94th percentile was Nicolas Timberlake in spot-up shooting. That would be a lot of what KU was asking him to do. He would be creating less for himself than he was at Towson. He also ranked 55th percentile, which is above average, off of screens. Out of comparison, Grady Dick was 34th percentile. So you could get an upgrade there. Grady Dick was in the 74th, I think, percentile in shooting spot up versus Timberlake being 94th percentile. Again, Dick playing better competition than Timberlake, but also because Dick was, such a important player for KU, he created so much gravity to himself that he was getting face guarded, and maybe Timberlake would too. But realistically, when Timberlake's on the floor, he might not be like one of the top options the same way that Grady Dick was, or maybe he would get open a little bit more. But you watch some of the Nicolas Timberlake highlights too, and he showed the ability to hit deep threes. That was something that we never really saw from Grady. Every so often, there were a few in there where he hit from maybe 25 feet or something, but sometimes it was almost like shoot more from deeper, shoot more 25-footers, shoot more 30-footers, because it'll just make the defense have to draw out further on you, open up spacing even more, or it might be your only way to actually get an open look. With Timberlake, you look at some of the highlights, he's shooting those a little bit more consistently. He's hitting deep threes to further stretch the spacing of the court, and he can even hit some tough ones off the bounce, though maybe not as consistently. You could make a real argument that while Grady Dick, probably a better player, and not probably a better player than Nicolas Timberlake overall, and did it against better competition, you can make an argument that just from a shooting standpoint, just that one attribute of the game, that Nicolas Timberlake, as a 6th-year player next season, will be better than a freshman version of Grady Dick. Now, would sophomore Grady Dick, or would Grady Dick, by the time he's the same age as Nicolas Timberlake, be, better? Probably, but that's not what we're comparing here. It's last year's Grady Dick as freshman to a 6th-year Nicolas Timberlake. And Grady did so many things, other things well, transition play, sometimes off-ball defense, getting some steals, rebounding, cutting to the basket, that he was playing 30, 35 minutes per game. With Timberlake, he might not be playing that many minutes per game, that you don't get the benefits of the shooting as often over the course of the game. But just from a shooting aspect, this is one of the better shooters in the entire country, with his ability to, get him off in a lot of different ways. I think some other strengths: he's a 6'4" combo guard. Sometimes you get in college those combo guards who are 5'11", 6'1" range. Not totally ideal to play next to DeJuan Harris and Elmarco Jackson. Timberlake at 6'4" gives you at least a little bit of a size there. And all things considered, he's been a decent defensive rebounder, I think, because of that size at 6'4". Again, it's against CAA competition, so it's a little easier to get those rebounds, and there's not nearly as many tall people in the CAA that there are in the Big 12. But just to show you, he had about a little over an 11% defensive rebounding rate last season. Takes out tempo and stuff. Out of comparison, Grady Dick was at 13% last season. KJ Adams was at 9%. Ernest Uday was at 13%. So pretty good defensive rebounder. And I think the other thing you put in the strength column is experience. He was in his 6th year of college, or it will be this next season, And it's good to have older players on your team. You're going to have a lot of freshmen coming in. Good to have that experience to help them learn. Good to have experience just in general in college basketball. Older teams tend to win games in March. As far as the weaknesses, the defense has been a problem. So this, not great. Synergy. Looking at the numbers, Nicolas Timberlake ranked in the 4th percentile. You heard that right, 4th percentile. That means 96% of college basketball was better in both overall and man-to-man defense. That is a problem. And that is especially a problem for a head coach in Bill Self, which if you make a mistake defensively, if you make a mistake doing one thing or another, you're going to hit the bench. And that can limit your amount of playing time, which if it limits your amount of playing time, it's limiting the amount of impact you can have as a three-point shooter. Now, we have seen KU players be insulated around good defenders before and them still be able to play three-point shooters that didn't really do much else. Think back to Brandon Green. You think back to like Isaiah Moss just a few years ago, and you were okay doing that, but that certainly goes in the weakness column there, and that was against CAA competition and not the Big 12. My biggest worry here is that he is Joe Cremo. I don't know if this name rings a bell for people. Joe Cremo was at Albany. I think they made the NCAA tournament 2018, and his last year at Albany, he averaged 17.8 points per game, around in line. I think actually slightly better than what Timberlake averaged at Towson. 4.1 rebounds per game, 3.8 assists per game. Both those numbers slightly better than Timberlake. 45.8% on three-point shots, 5.2 per game. That's better than the 41% from Timberlake, though Timberlake more 3 attempts per game. So all those numbers are slightly better than what Timberlake did at Towson, which Towson ranks about 20, 25 spots better on KenPom than that Albany team. So slightly better team. Both conferences ranked around the same on KenPom. But Cremo ended up, I think he visited KU, and that was a talk of like, oh, is he going to come to KU? He ended up transferring to Villanova. He picked Villanova over Kansas. He then went on to make just 5 starts that season. He played just about 16 and a half minutes per game. He only scored 4 points per game on 34% from 3. And honestly, that's still a useful player, right? He's still playing 16 minutes a game. He's filling a specific role of being a 3-point shooter. And you look at this KU team, you would love to, I mean, after last year where the bench struggled every game, you would love to have somebody who can just come off the bench and play 15, 16 minutes per game and can hit threes consistently for you. That would still be a huge boon to this Kansas team from where they were last year. It's a very useful player. I'm not arguing against that. But the worry would be, you know, if you give the scholarship there, are you preventing a scholarship from somebody else who maybe could play a little bit more or be a further bigger impact player? My verdict, though, when tallying all this stuff up, is that I think Timberlake would be a pretty ideal, perfect fit for Kansas. I'm not as concerned about the defensive limitations there because to me, they just need the offense. As I mentioned, DeJuan Harris, Big 12 Player of the Year in the backcourt. Elmarko Jackson, I would think, should be a good defender with his, size, length, and athleticism at a guard position. You look at some of the freshmen, they should be able to play hard and with athleticism to be solid enough defenders. KJ Adams, good defender. I expect Ernest and Zuby to take a step up in terms of their defensive ability, and we know they can be good rim protectors and defensive rebounders. You could bring on another transfer who, plays good defense to where they have the defensive insulation. This is like maybe not to this level of, what you expect them to be or anything, but the Udoka Azubuike, Devon Dotson team in 2020, that team had like the best defense in the country. They were able to add Isaiah Moss, who was not a very good defender, but because they had the defensive insulation around him, they were like, hey, we just need a 3-point shooter. Just give us Isaiah Moss, and that ended up being okay. And so I think you have the defensive insulation around you that I expect this to be a top 10, top 15 defense, especially with Bill Self. Just get the guy that can hit threes for you because you don't have enough of that on the roster. Get the guy that can make shots for you. And Nicolas Timberlake is about as good at that stuff as anybody that's available in the transfer portal. Let's get on to how he'd fit at Kansas in just a second with Locked On Jayhawks. So how he would fit at Kansas. As I mentioned, he would be your go-to 3-point shooter on the roster right now. He would be your go-to guy that late in the game, if you need a 3, you probably take him in. But would he be a starter? Would he be a bench piece? I think what ideally would happen, you assume DeJuan would start at the 1, obviously. What would happen is then you would have an open competition in the offseason between Elmarko Jackson and Nicolas Timberlake. Would it shock you if Timberlake started the first few games of the year and then Elmarko overtook him? Would it shock you if Elmarko started the year as the starter? No, neither would shock you. So I think what you're looking at there is Timberlake could be someone who plays really anywhere between, if the defense really isn't hitting and he's missing shots that night, maybe it's a guy that night who only plays 10 minutes per game. But also probably in that 10 to 20 minute range, probably looking at a 15-minute per game guy off the bench that can fill in for you at the 2 position, right? You'd move Elmarko over to the 1 when DeJuan's off the floor for the handful of minutes that'll be, and Timberlake comes in at the 2. Maybe you could even play him next to Elmarko and DeJuan for a handful of minutes in lineups with 3 kind of smaller guards next to each other. And he's playing as a bench player. I think the floor you'd be looking at, 10, 15 minutes a game, somebody who can come off the bench and give you more bench scoring than you were getting last year. I think the ceiling would be maybe he does end up starting, right? What if Marco Jackson isn't quite as ready as I think and we think is going to happen, but it gives you a veteran option that if he isn't end up being ready, like we've seen with a lot of other freshmen, that you have a real option who's played real college basketball minutes that can come in for him and be a 25-minute per game guy. Or maybe he even does come off the bench, but he still does play 20 to 25 minutes a game, and he closes games where you need the offense in there just because he fits a specific niche that you do not really have up and down the roster. So I think he would be a great fit for KU because of the way that he helps in a lot of your weaknesses, and I think it'd be a big-time get if KU is able to land him in the end. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. We'll be back on Monday. Maybe we'll do a deep dive on like Primo Spears or top 10 wing transfer options. I don't know. Maybe some breaking news will happen over the weekend and we can talk about that instead. So we'll see what happens next week, but stick around for it with Locked On Jayhawks. You can find us wherever you get any of your podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio, and you can also see us on YouTube. Have a good rest of your day.